When people imagine the fall of the Roman Empire, they usually think of barbarians attacking the city, legions falling apart, or emperors being poisoned in marble palaces. But the truth is, empires do not collapse only because of attacks from the outside. The real collapse begins from within, and one of the strongest forces that causes decay from the inside is money. Rome did not collapse only because of invasions or corruption. The decline of its monetary system was also one of the biggest reasons for its downfall. What's more, the events of that era still offer important lessons for understanding many of the financial developments happening today. Let's go back to the very beginning of the story. For centuries, the lifeblood of the Roman economy was a silver coin called the denarius. First minted in 201 BC, this coin was made mostly of pure silver. Roman soldiers received their wages with it. Merchants used it in trade. People also stored the wealth they had accumulated over the years in denarii. So the denarius was more than just a coin. It was actually a symbol of trust in Rome. As long as people trusted Rome, they also trusted the money it minted. But managing such a vast empire was far from easy. The armies had to be paid, new roads had to be built, aqueducts had to be constructed, the cost of wars had to be covered. By the 2nd century AD, Rome's expenses had grown tremendously. On one side, it was fighting the Germanic tribes. On another, it was battling the Parthians in the east. And internally, it was struggling to deal with unrest. But tax revenues were no longer enough to cover all of these expenses. That was the point when the emperors turned to a very old technique. Instead of increasing taxes, they began reducing the amount of silver inside the coins. They believed this would allow them to mint more money. At first glance, the coins looked exactly the same, but they were no longer worth what they once were. The numbers make the change very clear. During the reign of Emperor Augustus, the denarius was about 95% silver. By the time of Caracalla, that figure had fallen to around 50%. And during the reign of Gallienus, the silver content dropped below 5%. A coin that had once been made largely of silver eventually became nothing more than a bronze coin coated with a thin layer of silver. Of course, people noticed, and from that moment on, inflation began. As the real value of the currency declined, prices started rising. A measure of wheat that once cost 1 denarius now cost dozens of denarii. This wasn't just an economic indicator. It directly affected the lives of ordinary people. Soldiers began demanding higher wages because of the rising cost of living. Merchants refused to accept coins that had lost their value. Gold and barter once again became important. Local economies slowly returned to the barter system because people no longer trusted the currency. But as trust disappeared, the government continued minting even more low-value coins. This created a cycle that became extremely difficult to escape. And throughout history, that same cycle has repeated itself in many inflation crises. This crisis reached its peak during the period known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. Between AD 235 and 284, Rome experienced nearly 50 years of major turmoil. Invasions, plagues, civil wars, economic decline. Emperors sometimes remained on the throne for only a few months before being assassinated. Behind all the political chaos stood a collapsed economy. The value of collected taxes kept falling. Farmers abandoned their land to avoid paying taxes. Trade routes were falling apart. The Roman government tried everything it could to keep the empire afloat, from price controls to forced labor policies. But none of it worked. Emperor Diocletian made one final attempt to stop the decline. In AD 301, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices. With this decree, the government fixed the prices of more than 1,000 goods and services, from grain to workers' wages. The punishment for violating the rules was death. On paper, it may sound harsh and effective, but in reality, things did not turn out that way. Because once the currency had lost its value, it was impossible to control prices with a simple decree. Instead of buying goods at official prices, people turned to the black market. Official trade almost came to a complete stop. It didn't take long for everyone to realize the same truth. No law or decree could restore the value of a currency that had already lost it. Eventually, Rome was forced to abandon the denarius altogether. Around AD 312, Constantine the Great introduced a new gold coin called the solidus. Because it maintained its purity, people trusted it once again. It even continued to be used for centuries in the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, Empire. But for the Western Roman Empire, it was already too late. Years of devaluing the denarius had quietly weakened the empire's economic foundation. The armies could no longer be financed the way they once had been. Trade networks had collapsed. And most importantly, people had lost their trust in both the government and its currency. The fall of Rome did not happen in a single day. It was a slow collapse that unfolded over many years. And the collapse of its monetary system was one of the biggest parts of that downfall. So what does all of this mean for us today? It shows us one important thing. When a country's monetary system begins to break down, it can eventually shake the foundations of that country as well. Rome believed it could continue governing its people by issuing coins that looked the same on the outside while containing less precious metal inside. Today, many governments also resort to similar methods by printing more money, manipulating interest rates, or trying to reduce debt through inflation. But unfortunately, the outcome often remains the same. Once again, it is always the people who pay the price. People's savings and wealth slowly disappear. And eventually, trust in the government begins to fade. Rome experienced this in the hardest possible way. And history has reminded us of this cautionary tale time and time again. In fact, after Rome, history continued telling the same story over and over again. Nearly every major inflation crisis followed a similar pattern. Governments reduced the value of their currencies to deal with growing expenses. The wealthy protected themselves by holding real assets, but ordinary people suffered enormous losses. Rome's monetary crisis was one of the earliest major examples of this in history. Now let's move forward in time. After the First World War, Germany was forced to pay enormous war reparations. To cope with this heavy burden, the government began printing more money. Just as Rome had done centuries earlier, it believed it could solve its debts simply by printing currency. But once again, things did not go as expected. By 1923, hyperinflation in Germany had spiraled out of control. A loaf of bread that had once cost 1 mark rose to more than 200 billion marks within just a few years. People carried their wages home in wheelbarrows. The savings that retirees had spent years building were almost completely wiped out. Meanwhile, those who had debts saw them disappear. People who owned land, factories, or foreign currencies managed to preserve their wealth. Money had almost completely lost its meaning. And this devastating economic crisis helped create the conditions for political extremism to gain strength in Germany in the years that followed. A similar story unfolded years later in Zimbabwe. In the early 2000s, production declined while debt continued to rise. Once again, the government chose to print more money. The result was one of the worst inflation crises in history. By 2008, annual inflation had reached levels almost impossible to comprehend. Prices were doubling every single day. Stores couldn't keep up with changing their price tags. Eventually, Zimbabwe was forced to abandon its own currency entirely. People began using foreign currencies such as the US dollar and the South African rand for everyday purchases. Once again, the same story repeated itself. The facts never changed. And once again, it was ordinary people who paid the highest price.